Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is Tuesday. As always, I am delighted to be here with you to talk about another book with another author. In this case, we have the first book in a new series, and I am joined by returning author Alison Levy, who was on the podcast before. Hope your week is off to a great start. We are just charging our way through December. I cannot believe we're less than a week from Christmas, that it is the 19th already. But in that vein, hubby and I went to 2 Christmas markets over the weekend. The first one was here in our little village. It is a small Christmas market, maybe, I think, 15 huts, about that. I didn't count, but I'd say fewer than 20. But what I love about our Christmas market is the view. So it is up on a cliff, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. So if you stand at the top of the row of huts and look down between them, it's a double row, and there's picnic tables in between, and you look down, then you've got this amazing view of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's just, we went last year too, and it's just beautiful, and it was a gorgeous sunny day, and it's so much fun. And then this year we went to a Christmas market in a neighboring town that we hadn't been to. This town has a castle. The castle does have Christmas lights. Cannot complain about that. But the thing I liked best about this Christmas market, this wasn't what I liked best, although I did like it. It was geared, seemed a lot more for kids. So there were rides, there was a train, there was a merry-go-round, there was things like that. Fewer, opportunities to shop, but there were food, and there was a little play going on and things like that. But they had a giant lit up pink squirrel statue thingamabobby. I don't even know what to call it. It was an art piece. It was amazing. I have absolutely no idea what it has to do with Christmas, because I don't even see squirrels here, so I don't even know what it has to do with Portugal. But it was amazing. It was pink. It was the coolest thing ever. And now I'm just going to randomly throw pink squirrel into conversations, because every time we went by it, I would do the thing from Up, squirrel, and then I started doing pink squirrel. Yeah, this is why I probably should stay home more. But hubby's good-natured with my random throwing out of words and phrases. At any rate, it was a lot of fun. I hope whatever you did this weekend brought you some joy of a pink squirrel variety. Isn't there a drink called a pink squirrel? I don't know. I don't drink enough to know that. But you let me know if there is, in fact, a drink called a pink squirrel, or if you were to invent a drink called a pink squirrel, what would be in it? That could be either alcoholic or non-alcoholic. I would love to hear your recipes either way. So, like I said, we have returning author Alison Levy with us today. She is here to talk about the first book in her Witch's Odyssey series. This book is called Magic by Any Other Name. As I mentioned, she was on the podcast before. That was back in March. That is episode 403. If you are interested in hearing about her other series, the Damon Collecting series, she does talk a little bit about that. So after you hear this interview and you think, yeah, I want to know more about that, you can go listen to episode 403. In the meantime, though, let me give you the description of Magic by Any Other Name. As I said, it's the first book in the Witch's Odyssey series. Ivy Nichols O'Reilly has grown up in a wealthy family full of magic, fantasy creatures, and emotional abuse. But when her narcissistic mother arranges an unwanted marriage for her, the young witch reaches her breaking point. She drops out of college, changes her name to Georgette, and flees across the country with her best friend, a wood nymph named Mei-Xing. Georgette is determined to build a new identity and a new life, but her journey leads her to cross paths with a number of magical creatures. A Werehyena searching for his kidnapped wife, a vampire who runs a unique magical business, a curandero, a shamanistic practitioner of traditional medicine, and a Valkyrie who, along with her raven partner, wants to make a risky deal. who make it clear to her that the past is not so easily left behind. In order to grow into her new identity, help her new friends, and develop a healthy relationship with a man she's beginning to care for, Georgette will have to confront the privileges that have shielded her from the pain and ugliness of the magic community in which she was raised, and find the strength to overcome the trauma of her childhood. That is, of course, the description of Magic by Any Other Name. It is urban fantasy. I love that cast of characters that we just went through in the description because it seems more unique than sometimes you get. And, you know, maybe I'm just not thinking clearly about other urban fantasies that I've read, but to me this just felt like a unique set of characters that you don't often see thrown together into one story. I mean, how often do you hear about werehyenas, first of all? But there's just a lot of characters, and this is told mainly from the point of view of Georgette. I mean, no, it's told from multiple points of view. You hear from all of those characters. Georgette is the main protagonist. The storyline revolves around her, but we do hear from a lot of those characters that I just described in that book blurb. So you do get a lot of different perspectives from these very unique characters, which I appreciate a lot. Just a little bit different. They're complex. I don't know how much I like all of the characters. They make questionable choices, as everybody does, and as characters need to do in order to keep interest and have some kind of character growth and arc. But let's go ahead and let Alison talk more about the writing of the book, the inspiration behind the book, etc. So again, the book is called Magic by Any Other Name. It is the first in the Witches Odyssey series, and the author is Alison Levy. Alison, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back.
I'm happy to have you back, and I'm excited to talk about a new book and a new series. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, whether new listeners who need an introduction or people who heard the first interview and maybe need a refresher, that would be great.
Sure, great. Alison Levy. I'm an urban fantasy author living in North Carolina with my husband, our son, our 2 cats, and our 3 rough collies. I started writing as a teenager as a way to cope with what was then undiagnosed anxiety. I've published 2 books prior to this new one that's just come out. They are part of a different series, the Damon Collecting series. They don't relate to this book, so if you prefer just to jump into this one, you don't need any background for it.
Yes, and when you were here last time, we did talk about the Damon Collecting series. So I had that in my brain when you sent me the book for this one, and I was like, it took me a minute. I said, wait, this is not what I was expecting.
It's a whole new world.
It is a whole new world, and so this one is urban fantasy.
Yes.
And can you give it's called Magic by Any Other Name. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yes. My main character is a young woman, a young witch named Ivy Nichols O'Reilly. She grows up in this wealthy family. It's full of magic, full of fantasy creatures, and also emotional abuse. So when Ivy's narcissistic mother arranges a marriage for her that she is not interested in, she decides she's had enough. She drops out of college in secret, doesn't tell anyone, and just goes across the country with her best friend, who's a wood nymph named Mei-Xing. She changes her name to Georgette, and she starts building a new identity and a new life. But while they're traveling, they happen to cross paths with a Werehyena who's trying to find his kidnapped wife. And they meet a vampire who's running this very strange magical business, and a Valkyrie who, along with her raven partner, wants to make a deal with them, but is kind of secretive about what's going on behind the deal. So she kind of makes a decision. She's going to try to put her magic to use for other people's benefit. She also meets a curandero who's a shamanistic practitioner of traditional medicine, and he's also a psychology student, so he kind of takes it upon himself to help her grow into her new identity and develop this healthy relationship with the new man in her life. And throughout it all, she kind of has to come face to face with these privileges she's grown up with, which have shielded her to the real ugliness of the magic community in which she was raised, but again, in this very sheltered environment. So she has to kind of find the strength in herself to overcome trauma of her childhood and become a better person.
All right, now that you know a little bit more about Alison, a little bit more about the book and the series, it is time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about that cast of characters and all of their different points of view. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Alison Levy. We are talking about her first book in her Witch's Odyssey series. It is called Magic by Any Other Name. Let's return now to that conversation. There's a lot of very complex characters in the story, some of whom you're not sure, do I like this character? Do I approve of their choices? And so that lends an interesting level, but also I like, as you were giving the overview, you mentioned a Valkyrie and a Werehyena and Mei-Xing is a nymph. There's so many different characters, and often when you go into urban fantasy, you have certain expectations of what it's going to be. This one, I kept thinking, nope, I wasn't expecting that, which I love.
Glad to hear that. Yeah, I love being able to throw a little bit of a curveball here and there.
Yeah. So what was your initial inspiration or jumping off point for the story then?
I actually started writing this book shortly after I went no contact with my dad. And there's a whole family history behind that. Ultimately, it was the best decision for me. But a lot of those roiling emotions that I was going through and that people in my situation, going no contact with a family member go through are what Georgette's struggling with as she's leaving her family and kind of wrestling with her identity and her past. And some of the things that Georgette experiences with her family, specifically her mother, are things that I've gone through. And so writing this book was sort of a means of me to start processing that unhealthy relationship that I had for all those years. I did make Georgette's narcissistic parent her mother instead of her father. The stories are not my mom. My mom is lovely, but part of that was because the mother-daughter relationship just works better for this story structure, but also because it was kind of hard for me with the prospect of writing about a narcissistic father. It felt kind of triggering, especially at the point I was at in my life, and my anxiety was just ramped up to 11, and I had all this past trauma that I was finally trying to confront. I needed the writing as part of my healing from that. In some ways, I wasn't prepared for how intimate that would feel. So I think writing as the mother was it was a slight distance. I was still able to kind of bring in the trauma that I was dealing with and put it on the page in a way that I hoped would lend itself well to a story without me having to go too deeply into it.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually that explains a bit about your dedication in the book, which makes reference to it. And to be fair though, Georgette's father is no peach either. I mean, he
is not. No, he is very much sort of this, not really aware that there are how many children or whatever in his house. He's not dealing with any of that. Yeah. He is strictly kind of a 1950s father. He's everything is left to his wife, who is not doing well with the children, but he's just happily turning a blind eye to that.
Yeah. The story is told from multiple points of view. Georgette is kind of the central figure of the story. For Georgette, let's start with her. What about her as kind of the main protagonist do you think is going to resonate with readers?
Well, she's, as I mentioned, she's at this very pivotal moment in her life. This is the moment where she's kind of hit her breaking point. She's decided to get away from the narcissistic, manipulative family. And the book, kind of starts under the impression where she's got this headspace that she's weak and she's useless because that's how her family has labeled her. Or it's like, oh, gosh, you're so dumb, you're so useless, you're ugly. What is the matter with you? So she's sort of internalized that. And by the end of the book, she's learning to set boundaries and she's kind of starting to feel her own worth. So what I hope is going to resonate with people is that she's not what you would necessarily expect of a strong female character. In some ways, she's very fragile and she's full of anxiety and she has a lot of self-doubt. But that's how a lot of people who've been in her situation start off feeling before they put in the work to get past their trauma. And I really hope that's going to be relatable to people. It was, a lot of that was what I went through. And I know there's a lot of people who go through that. I mean, with the family dynamics that my character, Georgette, grew up with, she recognizes that they're unhealthy and she doesn't want to continue with them. But she also hasn't fully processed that this is trauma. And that's a case for a lot of people who have experienced emotional abuse, because a physical abuse, I don't think anyone could look at it and say, oh, that's not abuse. We recognize that's abuse. It's physical. It's obvious. It's very difficult to see. Emotional abuse is a lot more insidious. It's something that we, as a society, I think, are just starting to recognize how damaging it can be. So even Georgette, at one point in the book, when she hears her mother's treatment labeled as abuse, she kind of backs off from it. It's like, what? No, it's not abuse. I think it's a much trickier label for people to look at. So I hope by reading Georgette's story that people will see that, that there's a very dark side to these things that many of us grew up with and thought were just normal, and many people still just think, well, it's not good, but it's not abuse. So more than anything, I really hope that reading her story will show people that you can move past that. You can find strength in yourself. It's not just about being super confident. Sometimes the strength is just finding that little piece of yourself that you're willing to just plant your feet and say, okay, no, I'm done. And that's where she's getting by the end of the book. But it's a long journey. It's a long journey for many of us.
Absolutely. And she might not be as confident as some people would hope, some readers would hope. Mm-hmm. But I think because of her experiences growing up, she's very different from the rest of her family. And she's much more kind. Her family is not, they're not nice, but Georgette's much more kind. And she sees injustices in the system, in the world of magic, that her family wouldn't even think were injustices. So for me, I really appreciated that about her character.
It is, but it is part of her growth process. She's seen the injustices, but I think she has to confront them even more throughout the story to recognize just how privileged she's been. That she saw these things, but she had the option of ignoring them for most of her life. And once she's out in the world, she realizes, okay, maybe that wasn't the best way for me to grow up, and can I do better?
I will say that I really do appreciate Georgette as a main character, because she is trying very hard to break cycles, generational cycles, not just of generational trauma, but also just the things that she's trying to unlearn, a lot of the things that she learned. I really appreciate that about her character. Looking forward to seeing that growth continue in the next probably 2 books. I just, I appreciate that in characters that I read about. It makes them more interesting, I think. But it is time for our second break of this podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about writing from multiple points of view, how that presents a challenge, how it's fun, etc., all of those wonderful things. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Alison Levy.
Yeah. And she is the main protagonist, but then we get points of view from lots of other characters as well. So can you talk about the decision to write from multiple points of view, and were there any particular challenges?
Absolutely. Partly, I just felt that the different points of view were the best way to tell the story, to get a wider scope of everything going on. But it was also that I wanted, as much as I want readers to get into Georgette's head space, I think having the entire book from her point of view would be really exhausting and limiting. Like I was in her situation, Georgette at that point in her life is just in a near constant state of heightened anxiety, which is a lot to deal with. And there are even times I feel that in her chapters, I feel it's authentic to the experience, but it is also very tiring in some ways. You're like, oh gosh, all this anxiety, what do I do with it? And she learns a lot over the course of the story, but I wanted the reader to see the other side of the story too, so that by the end, she and the other characters have sort of met in the middle in terms of life experience. In terms of challenges, I really enjoyed writing from different points of view. That's a happy challenge for me. It's to, I got to switch gears and get into this other character now. I enjoy that sort of challenge. The harder challenge, I think, was to properly convey the sort of emotions that come with narcissistic manipulation. Because that's one of the reasons people don't see it as abuse, is that they don't understand how crushing it feels to be on the receiving end. So that was very challenging to get into and write across. I think it was also sort of a challenge to make Georgette come across as strong in some ways, because she is fragile and struggling in a lot of ways. So it was hard to get that strength through at some points.
What tools or techniques did you use to keep the overall story and timeline straight as you were writing through those different points of view?
That was challenging at some points. I did have to take a lot of notes, to remind myself, okay, I got to remember to come back to this. I have to remember to bring this in. But those are the happy challenges that I enjoy. And some of that is going back and rereading it for the umpteenth time and go, oh yeah, I forgot that little plot point. I got to weave that back in. I don't want this loose end hanging out. But yeah, some of it just comes down to organization, which as a writer, sometimes we're not the best at, but, it did force me to, pay closer attention to what I was doing at places, definitely.
I would imagine, yeah. This is urban fantasy, but there is still world building that happens. So you had to set up a lot of the systems of magic, the rules of magic, the way that world worked. Did you do a lot of that before you started writing, or did it evolve as you wrote?
As a writer, we tend to group ourselves into either the pantsers, the people who just write, by the seat of their pants as they go, or the plotters, the people who plot it all out. I think I start off as a pantser, and then once I get a grip on the story, I go and I plot the whole thing out. So I think I started off just writing what I felt that a young witch would be in this situation. And then as I went, I'm like, okay, let's make some notes and get a better handle on this. So the world building, I mean, it's very much rooted in the world that we know, just in extra layers of fantasy sort of put on top of it and put underneath it here and there. So the rules of magic, that was very much okay, let's see as we go, and let's see what I can develop this into. And it's a world that's still developing. Georgette has always been told by her family that she's the weakest, that she's the worst at magic. But a lot of that, as we see as we go, it's not that she's the worst at magic. It's that she views magic a little differently. She uses it differently than her family does. And she's able to accomplish some great things by the end. So the magic system, like I said, it's going to be a work in progress throughout all the books. I didn't want to throw everything as exposition at once, but it was, in terms of research, that was the thing that sort of came from within. The research, a lot of the research I did was into the different mythologies and folklores from around the world, because I wanted to draw in all these different fairy tale creatures and fun things. And I loved all that reading. I love myths and folklore. I love reading books that are retellings of famous fairy tales or mythical stories. Honestly, the biggest research I did was not so much on the magic or the fairy tales. It was on San Jose, California, because it's the primary setting for the book. It wasn't initially. I was thinking of doing San Francisco, but I thought, there's a lot of books on San Francisco. I wonder if I can find something a little less used. So I decided on San Jose, which I've never visited. But I did a lot of reading about it. I looked at a lot of images, a lot of maps, a lot of history. I wanted to get as much of that into my head as possible.
I used to live in Northern California, and I haven't spent a lot of time in San Jose, but every time I've ever driven through San Jose has been rush hour, and it's been horrible.
Oh gosh.
So that's my experience. Plus, getting "Do You Know the Way" to San Jose stuck in my head every time I drove there. But
I'm familiar with the song. I definitely put it on a couple of times.
Yes, I imagine. Do you have an idea of how many books you want for the series?
Right now I'm plotted out for 3. So I'm about 2/3 of the way through the second book, and I've got a rough outline for the third. So we'll see how that goes.
All right. And I usually ask, what are you working on now? So is your current project that second book?
It is. And right now the tentative title is called Wild Hunt. But fun fact, I have never been good about titles. Sometimes I come into, I just leave the title blank until the very, very end. And sometimes I even send it to the publisher saying, yeah, I don't know what to call this. So I do sometimes get a lot of help from the editor or the publisher saying, yeah, we have some ideas. I don't know why that's the hardest part for me, but it always is. But right now the title is Wild Hunt. We'll see what it ends up being.
I love it. It makes sense to me. I have the hardest time naming anything. Pets,
yes.
Oh my gosh, it took me forever. My husband named our one dog, and I named our second dog, and it took me forever to come up with a name.
Yes.
So completely understand.
Oh my gosh, now that you know way more about me than you ever needed to, in terms of the fact that I cannot name anything without overthinking it ad nauseum. You probably already knew that if you're listened to this podcast for any length of time. But let's just move on from my bad naming abilities and take our final break of this episode. When we come back, Alison will be talking more about the Damon Collecting series. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Alison Levy.
Do you want to talk about your Daemon Collecting series at all for people who might not be familiar?
Sure. My Daemon Collecting series, also an urban fantasy, but with a very different feel to it. It's about a daemon collector who's a person from another dimension coming to our dimension to collect and bring in for repair daemons, which are little creatures who exist a little out of phase with our reality, and they tempt people for good and evil. And her name is Raquel Wild, and she has a lot of encounters with some unusual people, some unusual things. And there's this sort of underlying shadow group that's starting to stir up trouble in her community and the rest of the world. There are 2 books out on that. The first one's called Gatekeeper, and the second one is called Blue Flame. And I'm working on the third one, although right now, because of the Magic by Any Other Name book coming out right now, Daemon Collecting is on hiatus. We'll see how that turns out. But I'd love to hear if anyone's interested in reading that, or just wants to hit me up for tell me more about it. Happy to answer questions.
Love it. So you've got the third one for the Daemon Collecting series that's out there in kind of the ether, and you're working on possibly 3 for this. Do you tend to do you have agreements with publishers, and that's how you decide what you're going to write next, or how does that work in terms of determining which series you might write for?
Right now, I'm getting a lot of great feedback on Magic by Any Other Name, so that's sort of where my energy is right now. In terms of the publisher, no, I haven't heard anything from them about which they prefer. So, because we just had Magic by Any Other Name come out, so I don't think I'm under a lot of pressure to do that. I do, because it's a hybrid publisher. It's not a traditional publisher, so they're not going to be after me as much as a traditional publisher would be to get a particular book out next. I have some leeway with that. It's one of the benefits of hybrid publishing, honestly. It does give me a lot more control over which series I focus on and which one I can kind of put aside for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And what have you been reading? Are you a mood reader, or do you have a TBR that you stick to?
A little bit of both. I have a list, but I do kind of pick and choose depending on my mood. I recently finished The Crane Husband by Kelly Barnhill, which was a fairly short read, but very interesting. Sort of a retelling of the classic Japanese fairy tale of the Crane Wife, with definitely a different twist to it. It was very interesting. And I'm just getting started on Katie Kierden's book, Rain Returned, which is the first of her Fell Serpent series. So I'm really looking forward to getting more into that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Internet presence. So I know you have a website, if you can share that, as well as any social media that people can maybe learn more about you or interact with you. Absolutely.
Come see me on Instagram. I'm at alevyauthor. I also have a new website, AlisonLevyAuthor.com. The old website is daemoncollecting.com. It's still up. It'll be gradually phased out for the new one. You can also email me at alevyauthor@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you. Is there anything that we haven't covered, Alison, that you wanted to make sure you highlighted during our time together?
Nothing in particular. I've really enjoyed talking with you. I really hope this book will resonate with people as well as entertain them. And if anyone has any fun or interesting ideas for mythical creatures I can add to the second or third book, shoot me an email, because I'm always looking for new ones.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. And I, like I said, was not expecting a Werehyena. So I love it.
It was a lot more fun to write than a werewolf. I think I got to take it in different directions, but it's still sort of a slightly familiar creature. So right, I was excited to find that in African mythology.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and for returning to the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Thank you once again, as always, to Alison for not only talking to me about the Witch's Odyssey series, but returning to the podcast, talking to me a little bit more about the Daemon Collecting series, etc. Really appreciate it. Of course, if you are a fan of urban fantasy, then you should definitely check out both of these series. You have 3 books to read that are currently out. 1 in the Daemon Collecting series, 2 in the Daemon Collecting series, and 1 in Witch's Odyssey. It's getting a little late to be, not if you have to ship it. So there's still time to buy them in physical form from a bookstore if you want to give them as a holiday presents, Christmas presents, what have you. Maybe a New Year's present. That gives you more time. Or, you know me, make up a holiday, give a book. But if you have a friend who loves urban fantasy, or if you yourself love urban fantasy, then I recommend putting these on your TBR, buying them, checking them out from a library, whatever suits you best. Just go read and support authors. And then, of course, you can tell Alison your thoughts on social media, how you liked the books, etc. You can follow her on social media or go to her website for more information. Speaking of social media, you can also follow the podcast here on not here. You can also follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. As usual, as I always say, I love hearing from you, so find the podcast and you'll find me as well. Come tell me what you're reading, what's on your TBR for 2024, did you meet your 2023 reading goals, all of those wonderful things. I'm nosy and I love to know, so come find the podcast on social media. In the meantime, of course, if you haven't already done so, like, follow, and subscribe on the podcast platform that you're listening to this episode on. That way you'll always know when there are new episodes out. You can also leave reviews on those platforms. That can be written, starred. Every platform might be a little bit different, but anything helps to get the podcast out to more listeners. Don't overthink it like me trying to name something. You can leave one line if that is what is in your heart. But I really appreciate it if you leave it. Also, join me for the next episode. I will be joined by author M.P. Woodward to talk about his thriller. There are spies involved. That book is called Dead Drop. So join me for the next episode. In the meantime, I hope that you are not stressed about holidays. I hope you're having a wonderful time with friends and family and loved ones that you are hopefully getting to see and spend time with. Don't stress. Just try to enjoy the season as much as you possibly can. And if you're stressed, drop out and read a book. Just sit in a corner and read a book. I hope that you find plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.